This is our second talk of this year's DocuFest, and it's titled Lost and Found, the Archivist Unearthing Images of Our Past. I'll first do a little introduction of our special panelists. So I'll start on my left. We have Adam Dawtrey. He's a producer. He has produced several documentaries with Mark Cousins and also has a lot of experience working with filmmakers who work with archives and film and history of cinema. So thank you so much for being with us. Then we have Jurij Meden, originally from Slovenia, who was the head of the Slovenian Cinematheque and is now the head of the Austrian Film Museum. So thank you so much for being here with us. And on my right, we have Tevfik Rada. He's an independent researcher from Kosovo. He has published several booklets and participated in created exhibitions relating to the representation of Kosovo in films from the former Yugoslavia. And he has also participated in a program with Ivona Jurij. The program is called Connecting Dots, Exploring Shared Film Heritage. And so Ivona Jurij is also an independent researcher from Serbia, and they will tell us more about the program they participated in, but both of them are involved with archive and analysis also of history of cinema. I wanted to start with you, Jurij, and I think it's a really open question, but it's really, how did this fascination and work started for you and with the signification of archive?
I mean, today, the more I think about archives, the more ambiguous I am. I must admit, I'm not so sure that archives are really that significant as we often think that we are. I actually think that, we are talking now here about unearthing images in archives, and I have had this privilege of working actually in 3 archives. I also spent 5 years working at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. And if there's one thing I learned from working in these big archives is that, and I also know a lot of other archives professionally, of course, is that practically every single film archive in the world, 99% of it, or let's say 95, to be more precise, is unexplored and will remain unexplored because we produce such masses of images. So I think that what we should be doing right now, hand in hand with unearthing new images and re-evaluating new images, we should also be thinking about forgetting some images and this, deaccessioning some things from the archives, because I think that just collecting images is not going to bring any good to anybody, because we always think that tomorrow we'll have more money to more properly explore the archives and to restore more films and more people will come, but that probably won't happen. So I think we should, instead of thinking of our work as something which we do for posterity, I think that we who work within film archives should focus more on today and what we can do with our archives today. And that's, for example, my primary occupation or preoccupation, interest when I'm thinking about archives.
So my question would it be, if we continue that thought, what does it mean of preserving the images of today? Do you think that it's something that we should do less of in general, or think less of?
In general, I think that we shouldn't be so preoccupied with preservation of moving images, because it's impossible to preserve everything. It's impossible even to preserve a selection that we wish to preserve.
I'm going to move to actually Tevfik and Ivona, because I think that was kind of the point of the program that you participated in, called Connecting Dots, and you managed. You got access to the Yugoslav film archive.
Actually,
go ahead.
Not, of course, Yugoslav film archive, but anybody can have access there. It's not you can go. It has a library, and the film part is, of course, much more difficult, and we couldn't have access. But I think, first of all, and that's one of the problems that initiated this project. Yeah.
Ivona, for you, you had the chance in January and February to come to Prizren. What were your expectations in terms of participating in the program, and what, if this work with archive, and what did you actually find?
Well, I didn't have any expectation because that is how it looks like when you work with archives. And when I arrived here, I realized that most of the archive material from Kosovo is moved to Belgrade after the war. So I decided to focus on contemporary cinema. I think that critical and theoretical work is integral part of archiving, and here it is very undeveloped. So I wanted to make a first step, and I wrote a short essay in which I tried to map the main topic and formal aspects of contemporary films made by women from Kosovo. And this essay is experimental in a way, so it's not strictly academical. I wanted to write something that can be interesting for a festival public as well.
So the research of Ivona started for about women filmmakers from Kosovo from post-war until now, and a focus of about 6 women filmmakers.
Six, yes.
Yeah, 6 women filmmakers from Kosovo, and it's the start, let's say, of this contemporary history of cinema, of Kosovar cinema. And actually, that makes me want to ask you, Adam, since you started working with Mark Cousins on a film called The Story of Children in Films, where you gathered films about children from global cinema. And wondering also this idea of like films on films and collaborating with directors who do that. Like, what is for you the importance, relevance of doing this work?
So I think we also made the film that's in the festival tonight, Celluloid Underground by Ehsan Khoshbakht. And we were at another festival in the UK a couple of weeks ago. And Ehsan said, I think we should be very careful about making new images because there are so many, every story we could tell could be told, the images to tell those stories have already been created. So we can use those images to tell new stories, to tell the stories we want to tell without needing to create new images. Now, of course, he did create new images as well in this film, but the film is kind of a collage of, which uses a lot of old found material to tell a new story, his story. And I think old material, not just film, is incredibly kind of creatively powerful as a medium to compose new stories. And from a documentary filmmaker's point of view, documentary film is a very, very wide thing, and there's lots of many types of documentary film. And the most obvious is the observational documentary, where you sit and film somebody with no idea where the story is heading, or you may have an idea, but it may take its own life. And it's a very open-ended film. One of the attractions of working with archive is you're much more in control of the story you're telling, right? You've got the materials to tell it. You're not waiting to find something. You have a story that you want to tell. You can tell it with archive. So, and it's kind of, I think I just said, but if I didn't, akin to collage. It's a way of painting images using fragments of old images, and that can have all sorts of meanings. I mean, in story children film, I don't think. I mean, Mark already had pioneered that in a way with Story of Film, which we didn't make, and Story of Children of Film was a kind of spin-off idea from that. But also cinema in its own right. I mean, and I think Mark is sometimes under-acknowledged as a filmmaker because he makes films about other filmmakers, partly. And one of the things, I'll do a bit of trumpet blowing here. We just finished a film with Mark called A Sudden Glimpse to Deeper Things about a Scottish artist, Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, which won the Crystal Globe at Karlovy Vary. First time in 72 years a documentary's won that prize. I think that's incredibly important to say that this is filmmaking. This is a filmmaker. And I think when Mark makes films about film, people are more interested in talking about the filmmakers he's making films about than the artistry in which he's creating stories. It's not just about slapping a few clips together and saying something vaguely interesting about them. There is a process of narrative creation in that as well. But but the use of archive can have lots and lots of different meanings, and it's just a material that you can use in many different ways. So in Celluloid Underground, for example, which is the autobiography of the director who was born a few months after the Iranian Revolution, 1979, a time when, by and large, Iran became a cinema desert to a great degree. The films from before the revolution were by and large banned or erased or literally destroyed. A lot of Western cinema was essentially banned. The kind of cinema they had available to them was a very strange piecemeal fragments of global cinema. I mean, Ehsan says he grew up watching East German Westerns and thinking, therefore, that the Native Americans were always the good guys, because in East German Westerns, the Native Americans were always the good guys, the cowboys were the bad guys, So it gave him a particular view of the world. But when making Celluloid Underground, Ehsan and Nias, his editor sitting over there, used fragments of old films from before the revolution as a collage to tell Ehsan's stories. So in order to dramatize a childhood, they would find clips of a boy doing the things that the boy in the story is doing, or if a character is sent to prison, we see films where a character is sent to prison. So those become, but that then also becomes, I mean, it's not exactly a political film, but that becomes a political statement about bringing back things that have been erased, and telling a story about a society where a lot of that culture has been, there's been an attempt to obscure it. And so by bringing it back into dialogue with the present, it is a political act, I guess, about insisting on the value of those memories and the value of that history and wanting an engagement with it. And it also, as a final thought, makes me think about another Mark Cousins film that we didn't make, Here Be Dragons, which was his film, which arose out of, I think, being invited into Tirana, into the archive there, to see those films, and the thoughts that he had about how Albania as a culture today, or then when he was making the film, relates to its own contested past, when all of these films, which have some of them have a certain aesthetic value, and many of them have a cultural historical value from the communist era, are now regarded as somehow anathema, and therefore like the memory of that is being suppressed. So how do you create a sense of, how do you relate to your own national identity when so much that's created it is now seen as somehow beyond the pale, which is what his film Here Be Dragons was about. How do you negotiate with your past? And I do think, I very much understand the weariness that you express about how much archive there is and how difficult it is to access and how at some point we have to let go of it. But I think there's also clearly a danger in that, where you're saying, in this world of, in contrast to the worlds where the archive is very tightly controlled and you can't see it, we almost have the contrary problem, I think, broadly in the West, where there's this profusion which itself is a limiting thing because you can't find anything. There's this sense that somehow everything is there digitally, but actually, again, the people who control access to that are controlling access to it. We've seen with some of the Hollywood studios and Netflix, like taking things offline anymore. So once you get rid of physical media, once you get rid of, people nobody doesn't own, if you don't own the DVD or the Blu-ray anymore, maybe you can't access that film anymore, because when you go to look for it online, you might think everything's there, but it's not, or you can't find it because there's so much and you can't navigate through to the places where it exists. So there's a lot of very complicated ideas, but I think making films out of this archive is one way to kind of keep them alive and keep them in dialogue with the present.
Absolutely, and I think also, originally my mother is also from Albania, and I think that was one of the main things growing up, that this dichotomy of wanting to know, to speak, to understand the history and what happened under the communist regime, and at the same time this discrepancy where you have to gain the ultimate modernity, in Albania, where people feel forced also to detach completely from that past to move on, but at the same time, how do you move on if you don't have anything to anchor yourself on?
I think there's a real difficulty in imposing, the values of the present on the work of the past, and it's very prevalent at the moment that we're all kind of rewriting. We can't watch this because it has all sorts of offensive, colonialist, racist, whatever attitudes, or people in it who are no longer acceptable, and it's not trusting the audience to understand that, to have their own context, and to make that judgment.
Yeah, I would just like to briefly comment on what my colleague said here. I think that the inaccessibility, the unavailability, the under-researchedness is the default state of any film culture or any film archive. some are more under-researched than others, but I think this is really the default state that's just going to deepen as time goes by. What Mark did was absolutely remarkable, because he, with an outsider's view, went to Albania, and then he very boldly identified a single filmmaker and said, she's the reason why Albanian cinema has to be salvaged. Her name was Shani Zekeko, and what followed were retrospectives all over the world. I mean, I've screened films by Shani Zekeko everywhere, and that was tremendously important. But Yugoslavian cinema is maybe slightly different insofar the whole process of dividing what used to be shared by all the republics is not finished yet, the inheritance process. So I would argue that Yugoslavian cinema is the last blind spot on the map of Europe. I mean, everybody knows who are the masters of Albanian cinema today, but Yugoslavia, I mean, there are several books, and we have here among us the author of a lot of eminent books. But truth of the matter remains that there's so much work needs to be done that will never be done for various reasons, of course also ideological. There was this big distinction between official film production, and then there was this parallel amateur film production. And then within this large realm of amateur film production, people were making everything: short films, long films, fiction, documentary, and a lot of that I have seen, I said, wow, I mean, these are fantastic works of experimental cinema. We always thought that the centers of avant-garde experimental cinema are New York, London, Vienna, San Francisco, but we had this incredibly strong tradition also in Yugoslavia. So if I may joke maybe a little bit again, I mean, me and Mateusz made a film so that you don't have to actually see those films. You can see our film now.
I'm going to open up actually to our audience members and to see if you have some questions for our panelists.
So I want to ask about the archives. Maybe some people know, but I don't, and I'm sure there are other people who also do not. I have studied in the past 2 years since the war in Ukraine started. I thought I knew, but actually it turned out I don't know about the disintegrating Soviet Union. What is the situation with archives? So I have now discovered things which I had no idea about. Like, for example, Georgia never received their own films from Goskino archive in Moscow ever, 35 years after the end of the Soviet Union. And only if somebody like you goes to the archive in Moscow and by chance finds a film from 1924 like this, Kote Mikabehidze, which is now doing the festival circuit, like, if they find it in the archive, they can then, through diplomatic channels, recover. And this is Georgia, this is Tajikistan, Ukraine, kind of essentially all the republics. So everything was held in the centralized archive. And then it is not a matter of just returning. It is a long and painful process, completely unfinished, 35 years. So this is my interest at the moment. So from this point of view, essentially what you are describing you are doing the first steps towards kind of like, outlining what material one day perhaps should be in your archive. Do I understand it correctly?
Yes, yes. Definitely.
And what do you want to see? So the question is, what do you want to see in your archive here? So imagine, 35 years from now, we congregate again. What do you want really to be? And so imagine, you had the magic wand tomorrow to reclaim what you want to reclaim. What is most important?
First of all, I think to be able to watch these films. Because
you're not able to watch them.
Of course.
And why, for example, somebody like Sergei Luznitzer, when he goes to Krasnogorsk in Moscow, he can watch and poach and make a film, but you cannot watch.
Yeah, but the Yugoslav Cinema Archive, which holds this,
right, and it is
very protective, and it's especially protective to researchers from Kosovo. It's basically, maybe for me, it's impossible to enter there and to watch or get some materials. And you know how the diplomatic relations with Kosovo and Serbia actually doesn't even exist. So that is also another impossibility.
The employees of the archive strictly apply faithfully what is the official life.
I think it has some state interest,
Yes.
ideology. So, but what would I like to?
What is
Do
your
we-
priority to recover? Do you have some priorities?
No, in the scope of this research project is to, what you said, to give an outline, and to give an outline not as a homogeneous single history, but more layered history, and to really look at this also to these films that are being said as unimportant and so on, but also to unearth some texts, discussions, other materials concerning the films. But yeah, more than half of these films cannot be accessed.
Check it out, Surfacing Images and Celluloid Underground. Thank you.
It's a great closing. Thank you so much, Jurij. And see you later at the exhibition. Thank you.